welcome to the 2021 International eConference on the Historical Jesus. Now, today's theme, with the exception of a couple of presentations, is all about a discussion on what's known as Jesus Mythicism. My name is Dr. Darren Slade, and I'm the president of the Global Center for Religious Research, which is hosting this year's academic conference. And one of the great things about GCRR is that you're being joined by students and scholars and specialists from all over the world, right from the comfort and safety of your own home. I want to remind everybody that there is a downloadable PDF file that was created specially for you and this conference by the Scholars Choice Organization. So 4 separate book publishers, including Baker Academic and SBL Press, have given each of you a special discount code up to 40% off to use on books related to the historical Jesus. So all you have to do is go back to the GCRR website, go back to the Historical Jesus event webpage, and click on the Scholars Choice logo that's near the top of that webpage, and you'll be able to download the PDF. And the last thing I want to talk about is the Global Center for Religious Research has established the most comprehensive international research group to study the causes, manifestations, and treatment options for those suffering from religious trauma. The GCRR has built a team of approximately 30 licensed psychiatrists, therapists, sociologists, university researchers, religion scholars, and PhD candidates from all over the world, most of whom specialize in the field of trauma research. But we have a really big problem. See, in order for victims of religious trauma to receive help, we need to arrive at a place in our culture where religious trauma is accepted as a real mental health condition. And unfortunately, the academic study of religious trauma remains in its infancy when compared to other studies in mental health. That means there are no exhaustive empirical studies to support what we've all experienced in the tens of thousands, that religious trauma exists and is a chronic problem in many religious traditions. So as it stands, really only anecdotal case studies have been published, but nothing substantially empirical. And GCRR intends to correct this gap of knowledge by offering an interdisciplinary and scientific examination of religious trauma. And we're hoping to get your help in supporting this project. We've set up a GoFundMe page in order to crowdsource the world's very first comprehensive sociological study on those traumatized by religion in order to help set the stage, the foundational data from which other researchers and counselors can build on in order to get people who suffer from trauma the help that they need. The reason we've set up a GoFundMe is because, unfortunately, all federal funding to mental health research has come to a screeching halt. And so that's why we've turned to the public for help. All you have to do is go to GoFundMe.com and search the phrase religious trauma sociological study, or you can click on the link that I'll put in the chat box here shortly. And with that said, I'm very happy to introduce to you my very good friend and our next presenter, John Loftus. Allow me to share my screen so I can give a proper introduction. So, John, today's presentation is entitled "The Jesus We Find in the Gospels Never Existed." So, John is a philosopher and counter-apologist with 12 books, including The Case Against Miracles, God and Horrendous Suffering, and Varieties of Jesus Mythicism. He's also the owner of a wildly popular blog called Debunking Christianity. I highly recommend that you check it out. Just go to debunking-christianity.com to check out this blog post. And with that said, John, you have the floor, sir.
Well, thank you so much. I want to say something about Darren, Dr. Slade, I should say, and the GCRR. I'm very thrilled about what they're doing. They're taking the world by storm. Their main values are a global research organization. And I find that interesting and helpful that it needs to be global. I think if you put religions together globally, you find some interesting things about them. You know, that we're religious as a people, generally speaking, we're superstitious. And when we look at other religions, they look oddly offensive and oddly incorrect. And that's an unintended consequence of doing global research, I would think, that the more you know about religions, the less you believe them and believe in any of them. And that is, they want to make their research accessible and affordable to the rest of us. There's so many publishers that sell books at $100 to 150, 160, $200 and more, and some of their conferences are just outrageous. So it's really helpful to get that research made accessible to people, like us, I guess. And they do it in published books, articles, and in conferences like this one. So I want to say congrats to you, Darren. You're making a difference, and I'm very grateful for it. Now, one of the things that the GCRR has done is to accept the publication of mine called "Horrendous Suffering" and the incompatibility with horrendous suffering and God. It's a pretty good anthology and has some really good authors in it. It's an excellent model for how philosophers, apologists, and theologians should have been discussing this problem decades ago. Skip the deductive argument for evil, that doesn't touch it. The evidential argument does, but let's focus on the most concrete examples of suffering in the world and pit that against a perfectly good, all-knowing, omnipotent God. And that's and you'll see that the horrendous suffering is as close to an empirical refutation of a omni God as we can find. And I'm really happy about the authors. Richard Carrier, one of the first scholars that took notice of me in about 2008, I think, or so, wrote chapters for me, and we collaborated together in different things. He wrote the very first blurb for that book, that anthology, to come out about Halloween. He says Loftus has again produced a brilliant gallery of informed experts now addressing the problem of evil from every angle and with such power and depth that it shall be a required reading for anyone promoting or opposing evil as a disproof of God. So I hope you look at that publication uh, by Darren's organization. Christian theists like David Geisler, which is Norm Geisler's son, and Randall Rouser and Chad Meister are recommending the book too. Dr. Meister is the co-editor of the Cambridge Companion to the Problem of Evil. So we have gotten noticed. Now I'm here today because I was honored to co-edit a book with Robert Price. It's titled "Varieties of Jesus Mythicism." It's set to come out any time now, hopefully within a month or two. We tried to collaborate that timing of its release and this conference, but they just could not get that out in time. Now, Bob, I'll call him, he never wanted to do another anthology after he did The Empty Tomb. It's a lot of time consuming work. It's frustrating. You have to work with authors, and sometimes that can be tough. I've lost authors in my years who didn't like my editing. I also was rejected by a lot of people I asked to write chapters for me. And then once they were accepted through the editing process, some of them had trouble with the editing process itself. So it's quite frustrating. You have to work with the publisher and the authors, write your own chapters. And so he reached out to me and asked me to help him get it published. And since I've proven myself with 5 previous anthologies, critically acclaimed anthologies, that's why he did so. We're also personal friends. We met on a few number of occasions. This book, Varieties of Jesus Mythicism, Did He Even Exist, answers the question that if Jesus didn't exist, then how did the myth originate? I find that to be a really important question. What we've done is we've got a lot of different authors to come up with their own various answers to how the myth originated. And so I hope you get that and look at that when you get it in a month or two. In Bob's words, when it comes to how it all originated, he says, "May 1,000 flowers bloom." In other words, throw out any number of potential hypotheses for people to consider. And in this book, we do that along with chapters on James McGrath, Bart Ehrman, and Maurice Casey. So I think that it'll be something you'll need to look at it. Uh, Frank Zindler, who's watching today and talking later, atheist debater, scholar, and editor of American Atheist Press, says of it that the book will be absolutely necessary for any future Jesus mythicist scholar. So that's quite an endorsement. The um, the foreword is written by Dr. Richard C. Miller, a scholar of Christian origins and author of Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity. He also writes for Debunking Christianity. He says this: the essays contained within this anthology draw their readers out on a provocative adventure, a quest certain to yield many treasures. Yet this quest is altogether different than that described by Albert Schweitzer in his landmark work, The Quest of the Historical Jesus, over a century ago. Despite the seeming nobility, such an academic pilgrimage to uncover the originary kernel of the Gospels, now having played out for decades in the halls and the academia, has proven little more than a fool's errand. We are now faced with the obvious: these cultic tales are not and were never given as historical footage of live first century events in time and space. So I commend to you that book. I'm excited about it, and but that's also why I'm here. I'm here because I was asked to help edit that book. Now, my own journey as a thinker on these questions, the questions of mythicism, can be briefly summarized something like this: I am first and foremost a debunker. I don't have a lot to say on what happened, only what didn't happen. That's just my thing. Uh, like it's like a historical scholar that looked at Custer's Last Stand and said, "Well, it didn't that massacre, that slaughter, that unexpectedly happened at the Battle of Little Bighorn by the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho tribes of June in 1876. Didn't happen this way or didn't happen that way," and so they dispute the how it happened because they were quite taken by surprise that no one survived. But once you do the debunking, once you say, well, it didn't happen this way or it didn't happen that way, a debunker doesn't have to step back and say, well, but now here, this is how it did happen. Debunker doesn't have to say how it happened, only that it didn't happen the way others suppose it to have happened. So that's what I've been doing the last couple of decades, and that is debunking Christianity in all of its forms as best as possible. So it puts me into an unusual territory here, where I'm with the people who are attempting to answer the question, how did the myth originate? You know, if Jesus didn't exist. Now, to do my job effectively as a debunker, I can't be seen as a crank. That was my modus operandi. I didn't want to be seen as a crank to those I wanted to reach. I must meet them on some common ground, the believers, the Christians. And to come out as a mythicist early on would have been counterproductive, I think, for two reasons. One, because they think that's a crank position, and two, things have not progressed with mythicist studies as far as they have to this date. I'll comment on that in a bit. Like example one, even though I'm a Bernie Sanders progressive Democrat and support most everything he says, I'm not going to disassociate myself from any conservative right-leaning atheist who has different views than me on moral and political positions, so long as they help me reach believers. That's my targeted audience. Since I have a target audience, I'm not going to I'm not going to want to unintentionally um, offend them. Example two: I have resisted taking a stand on Jesus mythicism for the same reasons. In my book, The Christian Delusion, I wrote a chapter called "At Best, Jesus Was a Failed Apocalyptic Prophet." That I mean, I don't understand how you can be a failed prophet and still be revered. And that was my point. And that the best I could see was that at the time that Jesus was indeed a field apocalyptic prophet, and that since that's the best case possible, that therefore it debunked Christianity. It's a kind of a halfway position between the Jesus is God, did miracles, and Jesus was just entirely a myth. Now I'm not so sanguine about it anymore about my chapter. Now, I do think that it has a lot of good things to say about prophecy, and the early church I think was by and large an apocalyptic movement stemming from Paul. But I'm not so sanguine, which because there's so many different other views of Jesus that seem to make sense as well. And putting them together is what we need to do, not to say and to pontificate on which one view of Jesus is the best view. So I've changed my mind, and for a few years I've embraced agnosticism, saying that well, there's not really much you can know for sure given the paucity of evidence that we have in front of us. So like Hector Avalos before me, who wrote for me and on my blog and for my books, I've adopted his view of agnosticism for a long time. You just can't know. Well, now that I've established myself enough that Christians don't take me as a crank, I am at the position in my life to say what I think. And that just recently actually dawned on me, editing this book that I'm doing in the conference here as I was thinking about it. At what point can we say all traces of any real Jesus are gone, and that they're gone because he never existed as a real person in the first place? We have to work with what we have, not what we hope will be discovered in the future. So, what do we have? And what can we conclude now? We can conclude that whatever traces of a human being we might find behind the ancient tales of Jesus, at best, they are indistinguishable from him not existing at all. I like how I said that. They're indistinguishable from him not existing at all. Any real Jesus is therefore an unnecessary figure we can do without. Now, this is important because it's good enough when it comes to God and science. If there's a God, then science progresses as if God is an unnecessary being, even if God exists. If it's good for science, it's good for historical studies with regard to Jesus. And so I think it should be good enough here that whatever traces of a human being we might find behind the ancient tales of Jesus, at best, they are indistinguishable from him not existing at all, and therefore, Jesus is an unnecessary figure we can do without. Now, let me give you a brief history of the last few decades of Jesus mythicism, which has led me to this thinking. It's grown. It's grown in intensity, in numbers, and it's grown in terms of the arguments. In 1985, the Jesus Seminar was founded by New Testament scholar Robert Funk. The goal was to reconstruct as best as possible the historical Jesus, what he said, did, and who he was. It initially included 50 biblical scholars and 100 laymen called fellows. They placed the burden of proof on any passage under consideration and voted on what they considered historical and what was non-historical. It had three main phases. Phase one, the sayings of Jesus, 1985 to 1991, where they looked to find out which sayings of Jesus were authentic and which ones weren't. At least they voted on it to decide. Phase two, the deeds of Jesus, 1991 to 1996. And then phase three, the profiles of Jesus, what best fits who Jesus was, 1996 to 1998. One thing that emerged from it was that there was a lot of disagreement. But afterward, there historically was little remaining about Jesus to be seen. A stream of books came from it. Although never formally disbanded, the seminar effectively ceased functioning in 2006 after Robert Funk died. Robert Price, a fellow of the Jesus Seminar, led the current mythicist charge with the first two of many books on it, Deconstructing Jesus in 2000 and The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man in 2003. I love that title, by the way, The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man. Um, the Son of Man continues to shrink until there's nothing left of him. And I think that I recommend that book to our previous speaker today. I hope he's read it. Following on the heels of the Jesus Seminar, the Jesus Project was convened in December of 2008. It was sponsored by and held at the Center for Inquiry campus in Amherst, New York. It was dedicated to exploring what can be known about Jesus based on a rigorous application of historical critical methods to the Gospels and related literature. The Jesus Project contained a number of scholars who felt that the Jesus Seminar had been too hesitant to follow where the evidence led. One of the most significant mythicist developments, popular developments, was the documentary in 2005 by Brian Fleming called The God Who Wasn't There. At the height of the new atheist movement, people watched as Robert Price, Richard Carrier, and others showed why Jesus mythicism has merit. Jesus mythicism continually gained greater attention, with Price being invited to exchange views in a debate book called The Historical Jesus 5 Views, which was edited by evangelicals James Bilby and Paul Eddy and published by IVP Academic Press in 2009, and included authors like John Dominic Crossan, Luke Timothy Johnson, and James D.G. Dunn and Darrell Bach. In 2014, Richard Carrier's massive peer-reviewed book on the history of Jesus thrust mysticism into the highest acknowledgement that could be held. Phoenix Press. It doesn't get any better than that as far as scholarship on those sorts of issues, on New Testament issues. The camel is now inside the tent. It might be possible it might possibly be the consensus among atheists. Jesus mythicism is now being taken seriously by such scholars as James McGrath, who in 2010 said mythicists deserve to be ignored like young earth creationists and other such groups, but has written extensively in criticism of it ever since. In 2010, the late Maurice Casey felt compelled to defend historical Jesus with his book, Jesus of Nazareth, an independent historian's account of his life and teaching. And in 2013, Bart Ehrman felt compelled to write a book on whether Jesus existed, and later he debated Robert Price in March of 2017, hosted by the Milwaukee Mythicists, who have held other conferences on Jesus mythicism. This GCRR eConference you're attending is a testament to the fact that mythicism is here to stay, and for good reason. Now, when I announced that Bob Price and I had co-edited the book, The Varieties of Jesus Mythicism, Randall Rouser, no unknown person in apologetic circles, seems to be debating everyone now these days. He wrote on Twitter, he said, John Loftus and Robert Price are editing a collection of essays on Jesus mythicism, the flat earthers of historical Jesus studies. Rouser's view can no longer be taken seriously by anyone who is paying attention. If anyone represents the flat earthers, it is people like him who believe and defend the indefensible without any objective evidence. The only thing I wrote in the book, Varieties of Jesus Mythicism, is a preface. And it's called The Jesus We Find in the Gospels Never Existed. I want to read that to you now. In 1929, E.C.C.R. introduced his cartoon character Popeye in a comic strip based on a one-eyed, pipe-smoking sailor named Frankie Rocky Feigl. So there was an actual person behind the Popeye cartoons. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's fictional detective Sherlock Holmes, with a knack for solving crimes through observation and reason, was modeled after Dr. Joseph Bell. Bell was one of Conan Doyle's medical school professors, so there was an actual person behind the Sherlock Holmes novels. Santa Claus, who supposedly brings presents to good boys and girls on Christmas Eve, is based on a 4th century Greek bishop named Saint Nicholas. So there was an actual person behind the Santa Claus myth. So what? Popeye the cartoon character never walked the earth. Neither did Sherlock Holmes, neither does St. Nicholas do a flyby over it. At their absolute best, these characters are composite ones with elements drawn from several sources, along with the mythical creative imaginations of human beings. But by speaking about compositive persons, we're not speaking about particular persons, people who actually walk the earth, much less any literary, cartoonish, or magical mythical character. The parallels are obvious. It's how biblicists argue with regard to Jesus. They do it along the same lines. Since there was an actual person behind the Popeye traditions, Popeye existed according to mainstream biblical historians. No one could reasonably doubt that Popeye was based on a real sailor who liked to get into fights if they studied history properly. Since there was an actual person behind Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, Sherlock Holmes really solved crimes in his day, too. So, too, Santa Claus really exists. Who else brings the presents on December 5th? And who else eats the cookies and drinks the milk left for him? All biblicists need for someone to exist is a literary figure to be based on real historical people. So Jesus existed too. It doesn't really matter if olive oil or Dr. Watson existed or Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. These additional literary characters are not relevant to the historically certain fact that Popeye, Sherlock Holmes, and Santa Claus were based on historically attested figures. So likewise, it doesn't matter if Lazarus or Judas Iscariot or Joseph of Arimathea existed. These additional literary characters are not relevant to the historically certain fact that Jesus existed. But to say that since the gospel of Jesus was based on a real person, that he therefore existed, is no different than saying that since Popeye, Sherlock Holmes, and Santa Claus were based on real people, so therefore they existed. Let's say there's a human person behind the myths about Jesus in the Gospels. So what? There are many non-historical myths about such a person to be found, significant ones. Examples of these include that he existed before creation, was one with God the Father, fulfilled prophecy with his life, was born of a virgin in Bethlehem, had the authority to speak for God, did miracles, atoned for our sins on the cross, bodily rose from the dead, and that he'd return soon. With so many non-historical myths as these, it doesn't make a difference if the person pictured in the Gospels is a completely made-up mythical person. He might as well be. The Jesus pictured in the Gospel is a myth. We must take the mythical tales at face value, then if we take the mythical tales at face value, then such a person found in the Gospels never existed. So the Jesus depicted in the Gospels never existed. If there was a real human being who was the basis for the Jesus character in the New Testament, he's dead now. But what if it's worse than that? What if there was no actual person behind the Jesus found in the Gospels at all? What can account for the Gospel origins? That's the focus of this present book. Prepare to enter into the ancient mythical mind, where in that world, anything can happen. Now, I need to speak as a debunker for any believers who are listening in. Just in case this sounds a little crank to them. My argument